Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Here to talk about The Legends of Heroes, Trails in the Sky, the second chapter, the latest JRPG I was able to complete. And as some of you may know, I played and beat the first chapter a couple of months ago. And I absolutely loved that game. I do have an impressions video also for that game in case you guys are interested in my extended thoughts on that game. But for this impressions video, I'm just gonna, again, I guess talk about the things that I loved and just my overall impressions of the game, the second chapter, which is yet another fantastic entry in the series and an absolute blast. And I guess the positive of being late to the party for me, personally, playing these games is that, I have the advantage of finishing one game and I can jump right into the next one. As I mentioned on my first video for the first chapter, I cannot imagine for fans that waited for this game to be translated for so long. The first chapter came out in 2004 originally in Japan for the PC. Fans had to wait until 2011 for that game to arrive, translated thanks to Xseed. And then fans had to pretty much wait another 5 years before the second chapter was translated and released in the West. So I guess, again, I'm kind of grateful to be playing these games later because now I can jump right next to the next games. And in fact, I already started the third chapter as of the recording of this video. So my goal will be to, I'm gonna try and complete the trilogy, the Trails in the Sky trilogy before the end of the year, and that's the goal that I have. But going back to the second chapter for this impression video, I'm gonna try to keep it spoilers free, even though it's a little bit strange because this game obviously picks off where the first game left off, and there's a lot of story things that are obviously related to the first game. But I'll just give a very on the surface kind of like impressions and overall thoughts on the game regarding the story, the graphics, the soundtrack, and the gameplay. So starting off with the story. No surprises here. I think the story is yet once again, the strongest component of second chapter. Just like in the first chapter, the story just really makes up these Trails in the Sky games. And second chapter, it's another fantastic game in terms of story because as some of you guys may know, this game picks up right after the ending of the first chapter. And for those of you that watch my first chapter video, you'll know that that game has a cliffhanger ending. It leaves you on the edge of your seat. And the first thing you want to do right after you complete that game is play second chapter in order to find out what happens next, in the journey of Estelle and Joshua, the main protagonists of the game. So obviously, second chapter picks up right where the first game leaves. And, it just expands the story from there. From there, there's a lot of expansion on things that relate to the liberal kingdom and who the, I guess, the bad guys are. And it's off to a good start, obviously, because, it picks up where the first game left off. But I did find this game is longer than the first one to begin with. So I think there's a little bit of a roller coaster in terms of the story. I think it starts off at a high point. It's very interesting just to pick up where things left off. And then towards the middle, I think it kind of dips in quality a little bit because second chapter kind of focuses on who the bad guys are. They focus on the evil organization behind the, who the bad guys are. So the game, I think, spends a little bit too much time trying to explain and develop who these, bad people are. And then towards the end of the game, that's where things get really crazy, really hectic. And lots of plot twists and surprises in the story, and that's once again where the second chapter really picks up, and the story just becomes very, very interesting and just very addictive because you want to keep playing just to see what happens next. And of course, the ending is another great ending in my opinion. And I'm not gonna spoil anything, but I'll just say that regarding the story in itself, I think the game again shines just like the first chapter. It shines a lot, and it's just a very addicting game to play just to see what happens next. In terms of the characters, you'll see a return of a lot of the characters from the first chapter, obviously, because the game happens right after the second chapter happens right after the first chapter. So you'll see a lot of familiar faces. And that's part of the charm of the Trails in the Sky games and the overall Legend of Heroes arc, or collection of games, if you will. A lot of world building that it just gets better with each game. You learn more about the story of this universe created by Falcom. Previous events that happen and the story. You learn more about each character, and the character development just builds up incredibly, because you're spending another 50 to 60, maybe 70 hours, depending on how you guys want to complete these games. But it really picks up, in terms of the character development. You get to know more about the characters. You get to know more about their relationships, their agendas, if you will, and of course, you learn more about the world itself. One thing that was a little bit criticized by some fans of the series is that there's a lot of repetition in second chapter, and I can understand that. For me, that wasn't the case, but I can totally understand because in second chapter you pretty much visit the same areas and regions of the liberal kingdom that happened on the first chapter. So some people complain about being very repetitive in terms of the areas you explore, the characters you meet, the NPCs you meet. For me, that was kind of like a reinforcement of the story and the characters and the development and the world building. So for me, that was a bit of a positive thing. But I can see why some people were critical of the repetition. So my advice would be to kind of look at this game as an extension of the first game. If you think of this as a complete sequel, sometimes we have the wrong, I guess, impressions of what a sequel should be. When you think of sequel, you think a much better game with much better graphics, more much larger scope and story and characters. But if you go into the second chapter thinking of it's going to be like a full-blown from the ground up sequel, that's not the case. It's more of an extension of the first game, and in fact they could have easily made the first game incorporate second chapter, but then again it would have been like a super long game. At that point we're talking about a game that would exceed 100 hours, which is not unheard of in the JRPG scene. I think some of the Persona games can easily exceed 100 hours. So I'm glad Falcom broke these things in 2 games. I think it would have been very repetitive and just excessive to have both combined into one game. But again, just think of this game as an extension, as a continuation of the first game rather than a sequel, and I think you guys will be fine. Now, in terms of the graphics, there are very slight improvements over the first chapter. I think some of the textures are cleaner. Again, this game uses a kind of like a game engine and graphics very similar to the Ys games that use the Arc of Napishtim engine, even though it's not quite the same engine. I do feel like some of the characters, models, and some of the textures were a little bit more polished in the second chapter. And but other than that, the graphics are pretty much the same. The areas you explore are pretty much the same. So in that regard, there's not a whole lot of improvements. They did add a couple more animated scenes, which is pretty cool. The first chapter pretty much had like the opening scene and then the ending as having those anime-esque types of intros or cinematic sequences. For second chapter, they added more of those, but they're not like super detailed. They're not like super high budget. Quite the opposite. They're a little bit on the rough ends, or rough around the edges, if you will. But it's pretty cool that they added some animated scenes every now and then, especially towards the end of the game, to kind of convey the storyline a little bit better. And so those are the graphics. And then moving on to the soundtrack, no surprises. Again, Nihon Falcom, they're well known for having excellent soundtracks in their games, and Trails in the Sky second chapter is not the exception to the rule. Another fantastic soundtrack that borrows a lot of the same tracks from the first chapter, but at the same time it incorporates new tracks that are also pretty nice to the ears, if you will. And unfortunately, there is no voice acting in this game. I believe there are mods that can add that function, if I'm not mistaken, but I played this on the PC on Steam, just a regular version, no mods or anything. But other than that, the soundtrack is fantastic, and I enjoyed it a lot. And now finally moving to the gameplay, which is another important component of the Trails in the Sky games. This game pretty much retains the same system, just like in the first chapter. It's a grid, turn-based combat system that obviously slows things down a little bit. The good thing about playing this on Steam is that you have the turbo button, so some quality of life improvements that make the experience a little bit more enjoyable, especially because this game is longer than the first chapter, so that helps a little bit. I think it took me my file I guess data says that it took me 64 hours, I think, even though my Steam profile only recorded 52 hours, which I don't know what happened. I think sometimes when the Steam servers go offline, they don't record while you're playing locally. So, but yeah, my Steam profile shows 52 hours, but my save file is 64 hours. So that was my end time. So definitely took me longer than the first chapter by a couple hours, but definitely second chapter it's a longer game. But going back to the combat system and the overall gameplay, it remains the same. Hopefully you guys after playing first chapter have a good grip on how to do the combat system, because I think second chapter overall it's a more challenging game. There are areas in the game, especially the prologue. Like the prologue, it's actually very challenging and difficult. So you have to have a pretty good understanding of the how to use regular attacks, and then your arts, and then the craft system. The special craft attacks. And the new addition for the gameplay, which I really enjoyed and I used this a lot, is the chain mechanic, where you can team up with 1, 2, or even 3 players in order to unleash attacks that deal more damage. And in fact, it's a little bit I don't know if using the word overpower is correct, but I found myself using chain attacks a lot because my personal play style is I like accumulating CP points, which they allow you to use the craft attacks, such as the chain and the special attacks. I prefer, or I try to using those instead of arts, because arts, they sometimes take turns in order to deal arts. So I like using the CP points instead of the EP points. That's just a personal preference. So using chain attacks definitely help the cause, especially for some of the tough boss battles. You can deal a lot of damage if you know what you're doing. And some of the arts that were overpowered in the first chapter, they're not overpowered anymore on the second chapter. So you definitely have to change your strategy a little bit in order to overcome some of the boss battles in the game. Also, similarly to the first chapter, there's a lot of side missions and side stories, which once again they have that mechanic that I complained a little bit about first chapter, where there's a time-based completion factor to the side missions, to the bracer missions. And I try to be as diligent as possible. Like I would go to the Bracer Guild every single time when I was in a new town, and make a list of what I guess side quests I should tackle first. And even then I missed a few. My goal was to try and squeeze as much as possible out of the story and the characters, because a lot of those side missions really have their own dialogues between characters and stuff. So if you try to get the most out of these games, it's highly recommended that you do all the side quests and side missions and whatnot. But I missed a few. Once again, I thought I was being very diligent and careful, but I wound up missing once again, a couple of side missions, which kind of upset me a little bit. But nevertheless, it's part of the game. Yeah, closing on the gameplay, it's really the same game with the chain mechanic added to it, and then of course, there's a new character that I forgot to mention in the story part, Father Kevin Graham. He's kind of like the new. He's not kind of like a protagonist in a way, because he plays a good or an important part in the story of the game. So you meet him very early on in the game, and he's one of the new characters as well. So he adds a little bit more depth. And another, I guess, gameplay novelty of second chapter is that the game gives you more freedom in picking your party. You know, obviously you're gonna have the main people that are related to the story in your party, but there's more room to change the characters, you know, when you're taking up on different missions. And I thought that was pretty cool. And you have to be careful and kind of use your common sense sometimes if you want to have special dialogues. There's some pretty cool dialogues that you will miss out if you don't have the right people in your party, but it's not terribly difficult to figure out who to have in the party depending on the situation, if you want to get more out of it, if you will. So yeah, that I thought it was a pretty cool feature, you know, having different being able to change your party members. That was pretty cool. But overall, guys, second chapter, yet again, another fantastic game. I really enjoyed exploring the Kingdom of Liberal. Again, you know, 80% of the game, I'd say, happens in the same areas of the first game. So there's not a whole lot of new places to explore, but the overall charm of the first two games, at least, you know, I'm playing the third one now, but the charm of the first two games is to get to know more about the story, the characters, the development of the different you know, characters, and the universe. You know, the world building aspect of it is definitely the strongest point of the Trails in the Sky series, and it's the main factor that keeps me going and playing these games, you know, one after the other. So hopefully I can complete the third chapter soon. You know, my goal will be to complete that trilogy, the you know, the Trails in the Sky trilogy, before the end of the year, and that way I can focus on the Crossbell arc, you know, next year. That'll be exciting. But other than that, hopefully you guys enjoyed this impressions video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all later. Take it easy.